It's a relatively small group, and I think all of you, probably with the exception of one or two people, know Sven, either personally or through his work in South Africa and Australia. So I won't spend too much time introducing him. We're very lucky that Sven is joining us from Australia and is talking to us about something important that we don't actually see too much of, especially in the literature on the South African side. So without losing any more time, Sven, over to you, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks everyone for making the time. Let me share the screen. Do one thing at a time, I don't multitask. Do you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Right, great. So then I'll kick off. So, Nala Kadich Wajak, Mordken Kadak, Nija Buja. Acknowledge the unceded Wajak lands on which I'm presenting from, and also the Balangara, Queenie and Marawara mobs where some of this work is derived. So the image you see over there is actually just outside my window. It's the Swan River, or proper name Durban Yergan. And I'll talk a little bit today about water and its role in climate change, and hopefully in sort of familiar and maybe some unfamiliar ways as well. The image is one of those sort of interesting images. It's 1827. It's 2 years before the Swan River colony, what became Western Australia, was founded, and it has that sort of quite calm pastoral scene. The narrow bit of water you see now is a big bridge across it, and the viewpoint is now Kargarup, or Kings Park. So I just acknowledge the traditional owners that are there. We're in fact busy working on a culturally modified or scar tree project in that park, but that's a story for another day. So so there are a whole lot of thank yous to make. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for everyone being here. It was really nice chatting to some folks. Then just to make sure, I mean, the talk is being recorded and all the permissions are in place for the use of images. Images are never just images, particularly with Aboriginal Australians. They have power, and some can be seen and some can't be seen. Everything in this presentation has been cleared and has been deemed culturally safe. And there are various people to thank. There's some funders. I generally find funders, it's best that they don't know too much about what you're doing. That way you can get on and do what you need to do. But more seriously, very often research leads to other things, unexpected outcomes. And today, the rock art and climate change is very much one of those outcomes that wasn't expected. It was on a project in the Kimberley, which we stumbled on. A useful outcome was giving advice on cultural burning, and cultural burning with respect to rock art and cultural heritage. So, and then a lot of the work it's always a team sport. There are all sorts of people involved, the corporations you can see there, and various government agency, philanthropics, and there are a host of other universities that I haven't put here, but that will feature later on. So advancing on. Right. So this is just, there's a short introduction, and then this title slide is really the roadmap of the talk. Sort of talking about rock art and climate change then, kind of in the past, now, and then the kind of various actions and reactions and the things that that are useful to do, and some things that are possibly not all that useful to do. Right. So as part of the intro, this is a fairly familiar trope to most people. This is just a set of random screen grabs from a variety of peer-reviewed and popular media sources about the threat climate change poses to human life, first of all, but then also to heritage. And increasingly, heritage is being positioned as a human right. And so damage to heritage is also damage to people's physical and mental well-being. It's a discourse that tends to be one of kind of finitude and crisis. It's not wrong, but there are perhaps also some other ways to have a look at it. So I thought I'd start with some visuals. So where I am now in Australia, so that the iconic view of Australia there in the middle of the screen actually only pertains to the last 6,000 or 7,000 years. At all other times, ocean levels were lower, back until about 120,000 years ago, and Australia was larger. So the image on, I don't know, it's my left, it might be your right, I don't know, but the other Australia image shows how Papua New Guinea was joined up to Australia, had this large lake in the middle, and that it was a significantly larger landmass, which has profound implications for the first human colonization of Australia, and then how people lived there, where their sites, including rock art sites, might be, and so on. And then the image on the other side is from National Geographic. So those two images are from Monash University's Sahul time, Sahul being the name of the larger Pleistocene landmass connected to bits of island Southeast Asia. And on the right is from the National Geographic project, When the Ice Melts, showing what would happen if the current projections are correct. Where I am here in Perth, proper name Burlu, where right now I'm about just under 3 meters above sea level, so I'd be well underwater at that time. And that's just an arrow for the Kimberley, Australia, and where a lot of the material for the presentation today comes. So this is the Monash Sahul time is from an animation. This is one of the last animations because it was on Java, but it's a very useful one. So along the top screen, you see the progression from the present back in tens of thousands of years, and then the ocean level from current level at 0 meters down to almost 140 meters, about 130 meters. So I'll click the animation. The little star is the area in which I do a lot of work. I do a lot of work in the Perth Hills and also up in the Kimberley. So the animation, I'll play it twice. This is what happens as you go back through time. That was quite fast, so I'll just play it again. And so it's not just the rapid loss of land over, but particularly you'll see the big trough there at sort of between 30 and 20,000 years during the last glacial maximum, but it's also the rate of loss of land at some times. So from that kind of 50 to 30, call it late 20,000s, there's a fairly gradual, slow loss of land. It probably might have been noticed maybe generationally. But then there are other times, particularly coming out of the last glacial maximum, unsurprisingly, where the loss of land is profound. And you sort of think of the human impacts if you're living in a particular area. Are you just free to move from that area elsewhere? Are there other people you have to negotiate social relations and other things with? What about your ties to that country, to that land, including things like rock art sites, which you then start seeing being gobbled up by the rise in ocean levels? So there is scholarly work going on in this. Colleagues, Joe MacDonald and colleagues, are working off the northwest shelf of Murujuga, so to the west of the Kimberley, finding stone tools, fish traps that are underwater. So this is also one of those areas, classic submerged landscape. The Kimberley, by the way, has after Vancouver, has the second largest tidal range. It can be up to 12 meters between tides. You read the diaries of the early travelers and they lash their canoe to a bit of rock, wander inland and come back and the tide's out and their canoes hanging down a cliff, for example. So it can be quite extreme. And people were certainly living out on the now submerged landscapes. The Kimberley, for example, today is 423,000 square kilometers, and from the bathymetry, there's about another 500,000 square kilometers that are underwater that would have been exposed during the time we know humans are here over the last 50 and 65,000 years. So if everyone's happy that certainly the potential colleagues at University of Queensland on the other side of the country are also finding evidence of submerged terrestrial sites. It has interesting implications under heritage law. Western Australia has 3 different heritage laws. There's very interesting implications. That's a story for another day. But a few people are saying, well, what about the rock art sites? So off the northwest shelf of the Burrup or Murujuga, soon to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Australia is very slow in declaring archaeological sites as World Heritage Sites. Budgebim, the eel traps in Victoria, were the first one a few years ago. But people are saying, what about the rock art sites? Because Murujuga has many, many engravings, somewhere estimated between 1 and 2 million, and they're on a very hard rock called granifer. And so the granifer is one of the slowest eroding rocks in the world. The Kimberley's Wharton and Carson Wharton sandstones are also extremely slowly eroding. So the potential for particularly engravings to exist are certainly there. So that's something interesting to kind of think about and to do some predictive modeling on, which you can also do in South Africa. So I thought, well, what's the South African situation? There's this great paper by De Wet and Compton from a couple of years ago that also then models the bathymetry for pretty much all of the South African continental shelf, particularly the Western Cape. So you'll see there the figures, there's somewhere between 165,000 and 400,000 square kilometers of what would have been land. Similar sort of situation to what I've been showing for the Australian example. And to me, it's an interesting thought exercise. On the next slide, so this is a similar animation that I'll start the animation, and it starts from about 140, 135 meters, and then goes up and then continues as if climate change would happen. So obviously sorry, it's been a long day. So what's that color? White line is the current coastline, and then the green and the blue are the other coast. Look, I'll just show this thing and shut up for a minute. You can figure it out. So again, you can see the fairly gradual regression, and then it sort of speeds up a little bit. And there's it going into False Bay. And then it starts to reach currency stand and then go above it. And this is what will happen if we go above it. So Cape Town really will be a world on its own, as everyone knows. Right. So there's another version of this. There's a 3D version of this, which is, hang on, let me just try and get to the next slide. Beg your pardon. There we go. Righto. Right, let me just go to the next slide. It should still be now full screen view. There's a great open source 3D model of it, and I've just taken a screen snip. Yep.
Sven, sorry, we've lost your slides. You might have to share them again.
The slides. Beg your pardon. Thank you for telling me. Let me just go back to the share function. And I knew that would happen. It's probably going to happen because I've got one more instance where I couldn't embed a slide. Can you see them now?
We can see the PowerPoint. There we go. I think we're good.
There we go. Right. There's a bit of a lag. Righto. So this is the 3D model. You can move it around. And what's really nice about it is that you can start seeing some of the relief and some of these ravines. And you can see there from False Bay down the peninsula, there's a row of ridges. Pierce Cave, the southernly most known example of rock art in Africa, might have a more southerly potential iteration down here. And I think you could do some quite interesting predictive modeling things relating to rock art and climate change in the past. Right, so that's the intro, then moving into climate change back then. So this is less of a conservation type talk and management type section of the talk than a research one. So a couple of kind of truisms, if you will. So, climate obviously changes at natural levels. There are things like tectonic plate movements and such like, and larger weather cycles that will happen whether they're humans on the planet or not. But then also, obviously, human agency has a big role to play. And the ArcheoGlobe project that Nikki Boyven and others were part of shows that, perhaps for the last 20,000 years, you can see measurable effects of humans on the planet, including the climate. And always there are pros and cons, despite the language of crisis, which isn't incorrect. Climate change also offers different kinds of possibilities to people. It can make certain kinds of landscapes available or unavailable, certain kinds of fauna and flora, and so on. And one thing I've been thinking about a little bit is the role rock art played at that time. So when the rock art, people who made the rock art, we're going through periods of climate change or periods of marked or noticeable climate change. Did the rock art play any role in helping negotiate that changing world around them, the world that changes environmentally and socially as well? This is not to take a kind of environmentally determinist kind of view, but rather to look seriously at those constraints. And in the new big rock art book that's come up, colleagues Peter Veth, Sam Harper, and Martin Paul have an article about climate change comparing mobiliary depictions in Europe and the Kimberley during the Pleistocene or the late Pleistocene. But when you look for articles like these, theirs doesn't quite answer the question I'm asking. They had a different set of questions, but there's not a great deal of work on this. Our work tends to be interpretive. What did the rock art mean to those people making it? But at the same time, I don't think it's mutually exclusive or contradictory to say, well, was the rock art also playing a role in negotiating a changing world? And I'll bring up some examples as the talk goes along. These examples draw from two projects. So the one is, these are funded by the Australian Research Council, the equivalent of South Africa's National Research Foundation. They're big multi-team projects. The Kimberley Visions project, I led that one, and then I was what they call a chief investigator, one of 12 on the rock art dating project, using 7 different dating techniques to date rock art up in the Kimberley. A lot of fun. You get to fly around in helicopters, keeps you away from the stuff on the ground, all of which is designed to kill you: crocodiles, king browns, feral cows, all of that kind of thing. And these projects have led to some great outcomes. In the screen snip there, the 2 Ways to See book was released just a few months ago, and it's authored by an Indigenous man, Ian Wayner, who's one of the traditional owners who works with us on both projects. And this is where I'll share screen again, just to give you 60 seconds of a short little little video of what just sort of the Kimberley landscape looks like, a video made for this project. There we go. So you should put the, so should be able to see that. Yep.
Yes, I think so.
Righto. So it's just 60 seconds. It gives you just a little bit of flavour of what the
area extraordinary looks like. Period of climatic change in excess of 50 million years. I mean, it's just like a timeline for a crime scene. Who did what when?
These pigments have been used for hundreds of thousands of years.
Crocodile came in from the north. There's the woman one and the man one. They look like they got married.
We theoretically expect to go back to the order of 40 to 50,000 years.
This is a man we call the Walamba, and he took our loan.
The cultures that were once on a landscape that today is like Atlantis.
These are the oldest records we have of the deep history of Australia. These are the oldest books, if you like, or libraries.
Part of our national identity is Aboriginal identity.
This is part of our evolutionary history. Surely that's important too.
Right, I'll get onto the stop sharing. So that's just that was just a promo for the project. And it just gives you a sort of taste of the people and what it looks like. And that'll be the last time I get away from the sharing thing. Right, so now we should be back to the full screen. If we're not, let me know. So that's Augustine Anango, just busy doing a bit of image manipulation with D-stretch, and that's like on one of the older art styles, the irregular infill animal period. This is just a little bit of the rock art that you have in the Kimberley, the well-known Wandjina phase, which I'll talk about in a bit, including that long red cockatoo feathered figure that's there on the ceiling of a shelter. And lesser well known is it actually has quite a significant rock engraving corpus as well. So part of these projects is doing the usual things rock art researchers do, but also excavating at sites. The excavation, as you can see there's a site called Borrologa on the Drysdale, Murrurundi or River, is under that flaking rock art panel to try and catch and date bits of flakes. And in fact, this was work led by Bruno David, one of our team, who found individual drops of paint in archaeological layers underneath that panel, for example. So that was quite exciting. Also exciting was Jean-Jacques Delanois's work. He's an archaeogeomorphologist who was able to construct how the shelter had formed, how the rocks had fell out, and also to see that many of those rocks their current position cannot be explained by natural means, by gravity, just the opposite. In other words, people were actively moving bits of the furniture, as it were, around to create these spaces. They're not just pre-existing shelters that people move into. They move into and they move bits around, and sometimes do actually quite major construction works of challenging that notion of the hunter-gatherer, just kind of wandering through the landscape type of thing. At the conclusion of each field season, which typically lasts 2 to 9 weeks, we do a series of presentations back to community and to the local schools through the CSIRO's Scientist in Schools program, and do these posters, which is all what the traditional owners want, that captures each field season and more or less what we did. The trick here is just to have lots of people in them. In the beginning, I made the mistake of having lots of archaeology in them, but our partners don't like that. They prefer seeing lots of people, so there you are. And then this work also services what are called healthy country plans. Aboriginal corporations, there's a corporation that represents a particular, if you like, clan, estate and group. They represent the interests of that group, and they have decadal healthy country plans that look at country. So the Aboriginal notion of country, people are very tied to the country, and there's a reciprocal relationship between yourself and country, and you have to look after each other. It's not unlike sort of African ancestor veneration. You look after the ancestors, they'll look after you. And same sort of thing here. So we take direction from the directors of these corporations and also the Aboriginal rangers, and look where we need to work into. Where are the areas of poor or fair health? So, for example, if you do a good burning program around rock art sites, you take care of the natural health of that cultural site. Or if you perform a ceremony where at a dugong breeding site, you take care of the cultural health of that chunk of landscape. And we then produce these heat maps of the areas we've worked in to show relative densities of sites. We didn't only look for rock art sites. These include stone arrangements, quarry sites, pigment sites, stone tools, campsites, and all of those kinds of things. Also very useful for land management, because this area is also quite wealthy in minerals, bauxite, gold, diamonds, and such like. And we're constantly knocking back mining claims based on the mapping of cultural heritage sites, for example. Okay, getting into rock art and climate change is that as part of this work in the dating project, we managed to date this sort of 2-meter high macropod that you can see a redrawing of in the screen snip there, to about 17,300 years old. It was dated by using mud wasp nests, not using OSL, optically stimulated luminescence, but using AMS based on the minute amounts of organic matter contained within the mud wasps. And this was Damien Finch's work for his PhD project, really pioneering work. And he would take samples from mud wasp nests over and under pigment. The samples were all taken generally by traditional owners with permits, with minimal damage, if any, to the art. We've taken about 600 samples, and other than the cosmogenic samples, which are off art, they fit into a kind of large Ziploc bag. So the first paper that came out dated Guion, or in the old language, Bradshaw. We don't use that word anymore, colonial term, no, not a term to use. But that's the rock art tradition that was argued to be non-Aboriginal, you know, a bit of like Great Zimbabwe and Queen of Sheba. But this dating managed to put the kibosh on that and empirically disprove it. The 17,300-year-old one got everyone excited because it was old. And next slide, I'll just talk about old a little bit. But that date, 17,300, so you can see from the map, the insert, that the macropod image, when it was made in that area called Art Sites near Kalambaroo, the coast would have been about 500 kilometers away. So you can see the dark green coastal outline. So it's only about 50 kilometers from the coast today. It would have been almost 10 times that distance back in the past, which really changes our understanding of that landscape and meaning context. But also, this is the time when we're emerging from the last glacial maximum. And until recently, there was a kind of trope that during the last glacial maximum, it was colder and it was more arid. And so the idea was that people were struggling. They were just surviving. They were just kind of hanging on in there. But this date, the pigment comes from at least 200 kilometers away. This is one of dozens of similar sites in the same style. It's called the irregular infill animal style. And You can see from the shelter there, it's on the ceiling of the shelter. The shelter, it's at quite an angle. It was actually probably, the shelter was probably level. It was probably on a ceiling above one, because parts of it are almost impossible to get to or paint today. So this sort of decries the notion that people were just struggling during periods of climate change. They were, in fact, if anything, perhaps activating art, not only the art, but the social networks and relations you need to source raw material and do the act of painting and maintenance of painting itself, for example. So the number itself is uninteresting. The number in the date in context with the last glacial maximum becomes much more interesting. That sort of leads off into, this is where we were talking about rants earlier, David, the rants on, what do we mean when we say a date, for example, and transmit this back to David Lewis Williams and his long-standing thing against chronocentrism, because you'll see the title of the article we had there in Nature Human Behaviour, Ages for Australia's Oldest Rock Paintings. And I had quite a battle, which I lost, with co-authors and some co-authors and Nature, saying this isn't in fact the oldest rock painting. There are fragments from Nawala Garbamung at 28,000 years, for example, and the screen snip you see there is a chunk of limestone smeared with ochre that comes from Carpenter's Gap and fell into an archaeological layer, quite a substantial chunk, at least 41,000 years ago. But because it isn't a recognizable image, people don't really like it as a as rock art, for example. And the title for that article is actually possibly a little bit misleading. Maybe another way to put it is this tale of two sites. So on the right-hand side, where you've got that red dune type feature, fluvial feature, this is a site as part of this research we found. It's not a rock art site, it's a habitation site, and we dated it with OSL and AMS to pretty much about 50,000, depending which side of the Bayesian analysis you want to come out of. Long story short is it made, it made a lot of international and national press. University, all the project funders were very happy because it was an oldest. So that's why people enjoyed it. But then when I took traditional owners, Ian Wayner, who I mentioned before, and said, oh, isn't this very exciting? Have a look at it. He sort of looked around. We found very nice, what are called bicycle saddle hand axes and things there. He said, it's a nice place to fish. And that was the begin and finish of his comments along the Drysdale River. It's a nice place to fish. He was singularly unimpressed with that date. He said, well, Aboriginal people have always been here. If that number, 50,000, convinces you of that, great. We then move literally to the other side of the river and a couple of kilometers away. And we get to the other site you see in the slide there with that large image I showed before. And we did some work on a metal cache from leaf springs, vehicle leaf springs fashioned into spears and things like that, dating from the 1950s, and this Wandjina style art that might go up to 6,000 years old. Published in Journal of Social Archaeology, put it through our press office and everything. And it got absolutely no traction whatsoever in terms of media coverage. But when we took traditional owners there, they came alive. They said, this is really important because we can now link both images and some of the artifacts to known individuals. It's on a known track that people traveled in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And its social traction and social richness was much greater than the temporarily much more distant site. So that all, to me, is encapsulated nicely in this cluster of images. That's that large macropod you saw before. It's slightly longer than a human, in that there are multiple temporalities here. Here in the background, these human figures with these very long headdresses, which did actually exist. We have ethnographic examples of it. These are Guion, or in the old language, Bradshaw, or some of the Queenie call them Kira figures. We know these tend to be 12 to 13,000 years old. They're underneath, or seem to be underneath, this macropod. There's a row at the bottom of flying foxes that you'll notice have been pecked or hammered back in the past. It's quite patinated. There's stencils of boomerangs in parts of it, hand stencils, and so on. But when you look at, and then at the top, you've got all of these delicious mud wasp nests, which then can be dated. And that image I showed you before of the OSL AMS dating comes from this site. But if you look closely at the macropod, you'll see that the bright red or light red color is actually painted on top of an older mulberry colored pigment from something that was from probably the irregular infant animal period that is under those guions. The guion is on top of the kangaroo, and then the repainting on top of all of those together. So taken together, it's an ensemble, a suite that shows that shows a long trajectory of people looking after country and maintaining it through different sets of climatic regimes, not necessarily continuously. It might be punctuated, but it's a nice long record. And that repainting notion brings us to a clear example of climate change rock art, which are the Wandjina, spelt differently depending which group you're working on. Interestingly, there's Images of Power, a title that might be familiar to some. And in an Imic understanding, Wandjina are actual beings, are things in themselves. And in Southern African rock art, through work like David's and Pat Finicum's, that's cognate with South Africa. People say these Wandjina, these things you call paintings, are the actual Wandjina resting on the rock walls as they travel through country. And then authorized people have a remit and a responsibility to renew or to repaint these Wandjinas. And these Wandjinas are very strongly implicated in weather events, especially rain events. They're almost never depicted with a mouth, because it's said if they had a mouth, it would never ever stop raining. So some of the Wandjina repainting episodes have tens of layers of repainting the areas that have naturally flaked off, and we can microscopically count the layers, for example. And so the available dating tells us that Wandjinas are still being produced today, and I'll show you an example of that, I think, in the next slide. But the available dating, fortunately, those big black eyes are generally charcoal, so that's eminently datable. And they're the oldest known dates. They're sort of 4 and some argue up to 6,000 years ago. Now, this is a very interesting period in terms of Australia. This is the period of high sea stand and a slight subsidence. There's rapid inundation, and a whole lot of things are happening in and about this time. There's still a lot of work to be done. In the screen snip there, you can see these. It's a slider. If you go onto that URL, there's a very neat slider. So that site I showed you, if you can, I don't know if you can see the mouse arrow, but the 17,000 site is down here, and there's this whole Gulf of Melita, as it's called, that would have been available, almost certainly would be an incredibly rich rock art province, but which is now underwater. So this would have happened generationally. People over generations would see the change in ocean level. Also at this time, we have dingoes coming in. We don't know how they came in, but somewhere in that 4,000 to 6,000 year bracket, they're coming in. The screen snip there shows they have burials for the dingo. Very interesting things happen linguistically, what we call the Pamanungan languages. They seem to spring up from nowhere at around this time as well. You have new material culture, such as barbed spears and spear throwers coming along. The classic Kimberley points, as they're known, and stone arrangements, such as you see over there. Some stone arrangements have ethnography associated with them, saying they were put at certain areas on the coast to stop the ocean level rise, for example. And so the Wandjina, the maintaining of the Wandjina, the keeping the Wandjina happy so that you're not inundated with rain, as I say, is a good example of climate change rock art. And this is the example here. This is at Raft Point. The person who repainted it passed away last year, so I won't mention their name. But I was with them in 2019 when they did the repainting of the head of that Wandjina. They haven't quite finished the cockatoo feathers. But as explained to me, it was that this is an ongoing maintenance of country through an ancestral being, and with particular attention to the weather, and not just the weather, explicitly to climate change, saying that climate change has happened for quite a long time. We've got oral histories that reliably tell us snippets of probably the last glacial maximum and certainly the high sea stand, but then very much about climate change today and how it's affecting people's lives in North Australia. North Australia is a tropical zone. It's climatically very active, and you can have quite extreme weather events. And people up there were Auroran peoples from the Auroran families that make Wandjina and authorized to make Wandjina, say, well, the world isn't getting any better in terms of climate change, which is one of the main reasons why we continue to make Wandjina and continue to maintain Wandjina, for example. So that's a bit of rock rock art kind of then and the role rock art plays for its makers in managing a changing world around them. And so now in the last sort of 15 minutes or so, just move to rock art and climate change now, which is probably the more kind of familiar trope in which, what is climate change doing? Usually a threat to heritage now. It is a threat, although sometimes things like retreating glaciers also release artifacts. Alaskan rangers are now trained to identify artifacts from retreating glaciers, for example. But the screen snip article by Gillian Huntley and colleagues talking about Sulawesi, where some exciting sort of 40,000+ dates have come on. Those sites are rapidly flaking away with climate change. So very often the language here is that there's a technological solution to the kind of climate change at the expense of looking in a critical way at the structural issues that both prevent and enable actions that we might undertake. So I've just taken an elemental approach using fire and water, both as a conservation issue and for research opportunities. So my first real kind of awakening was with Tuinkiersberg, that many of you are familiar with. So Tuinkiersberg, one of the rock art national monuments, even under the old legislation, then under the new. And what you see in the main slide in front of you is the boardwalk that Jannie Loubser and Gordon Lawrence put in the site with the interpretive notice boards. That was incredibly useful for all the visitors, particularly school children, to the site. It was fire treated, this boardwalk. But what then happened is a particularly hot veld fire came along, and it caused this over here. So I had actually just got off the airport at what was then still Jan Smuts, and was told Tuinkiersberg had burnt down. And I drove there, and I had Paul Tayson with me, who you'll see in shot there, as we were doing our sort of reciprocal exchange. And you can see the boardwalk has burnt down, large piece of rock, and other pieces of rock have detached. Then over a period of about 2 years, we managed to rehabilitate the site. There are lots of people involved. Jeanette Deacon was incredibly helpful with National Monuments at the time. Mike van Vurigen, a geotechnical engineer, the Trans-Carib branch of the Archaeological Society, residents of Ladybrand. The only entity that wasn't particularly helpful was my employer at the time, who didn't consider any of this work to be core archaeological business, and I actually almost lost my job as a result of it. But it had a certain poetic justice. You can see the floor. We put nice non-flammable sandstone slices. Those slices were taken from the ruins of Paul Lowenstein's house in Ladybrand. Paul Lowenstein, as some of you will know, was one of the people who collected or cut rock art out of shelters in the 1940s and into the early 1950s, as was done at that time. But it's now come full circle. We cut up his house and put it in a rock shelter and put it in like that. And that the image of the rock art there is one that Jannie argued was a rain animal. So again, in the iconography, you have potentially, certainly a weather-related or elemental-related rock art that may or may not have been related to climate change. It does seem as though rain animals come up strongly in the more recent part of the rock art, typically being linked to the arrival of African farmers, but worth considering whether they might also be linked to events like little ice ages and those kinds of things. Moving to Australia, exactly the same problem. You can see the screen snip from Carnarvon Gorge. Notice the boardwalk, which also was promised to be fire-resistant material, but in fact it added to the fuel load, and you can see the damage it caused to this cave called Balloon Cave. And it's an issue that was taken up in Parliament. As you can see, our Minister for the Environment at the time, Susan Ley, talks about how that 6 of Australia's 20 World Heritage Sites had suffered from the 2019-2020 fires. So much so is this a problem that the Australian Archaeological Association, the equivalent of ASAPA, has a bushfire archaeologists initiative, of which I'm part, and which we give advice on bushfire mitigation, but also come in after bushfires to see what the damage is and what remediation might be done. People do forget, however, that fire is an essential artifact. The slide is really more for an Australian audience. It doesn't need any explanation to people there. But it's one of those evidences of, in Sahul, or or latterly Australia, of human colonization and land use. There's been a big controversy around Bruce Pascoe's book, Dark Emu, about the level that, were they foragers or were they farmers kind of thing. And you can see the Sutton and Walsh riposte to that. Unfortunately, it's become a very polarized debate, and it's accepted the poles as being you're either a forager or a farmer, and not allowing for a much more subtle manipulation of environment in between. So, Australian Aboriginal people, that 17,000-year-old site, it's no surprise that they weren't just surviving, that they were thriving, because they'd been on that landscape, by our reckoning anyway, for tens of thousands of years. We know people did quite a lot of things with plants, diverting natural water runoffs to naturally occurring stands of plants, doing some weeding, doing all of those different kinds of things. Interesting work on gender and fire as well. So in addition to the conservation angles, there are some quite heavy duty research questions to ask. This slide is really, you can look at and read at your leisure. And I'll return to the last point, really, is that the point about heritage and its linkage to human health, physical and mental. And then just going globally, again, that ArchaeoGlobe project, fire is one of those early indicators, both through the quantity and types of ash and pollens and phytoliths that you find, but also evidence for example, patch burning as opposed to widespread fires, about the human effects on the planet through burning with the onset of particularly agriculture, for example, and how it may or may not define the Anthropocene. I see the Anthropocene's been shot down by the geological lot that decide on epochs and that, but nonetheless, the human effect on the environment has been going on for at least 20,000 years or so. Switching then to water, same story, water, whether it's through floods, melting glaciers, changing of microclimates, all of those kinds of things has an effect on human life, well-being and heritage. Flipping the script slightly, looking to Southern Africa first, is, they're sort of the human sides of things, like the Lesotho Highlands water scheme. It's great to see Peter here. Congratulations again, Peter, on the second edition on the book. And here's that great article in African Archaeological Review that Charlie Arthur led, and that you also co-published, and lots of other people were part of, about the damage to archaeology done to particularly rock art sites, and how some of these had to be removed. Jannie Loubser and other dam schemes have to do a similar kind of thing. These dams tend to last less than 100 years, all for essentially Joburg's water causing this massive damage. There's also the issue of groundwater and subsidence. I've got that Magabeng picture in because I've recently given in a submission to around the Magabeng and the notion of underwater drilling there. So it's in my capacity as acting vice chair of the ICOMOS's CAR, Committee Art Rupestre, saying that when you mine underground, you change the hydrology, and this leads to things like subsidence, cracking of rock art shelters, and they're largely unknown effects. And no one actually has any proof concept, proved examples of that it does or doesn't cause damage, but on a cautionary principle, it shouldn't be allowed until we have those. Also, the effects of fertilizers leaching out through the groundwater and either going as skins over rock art, or going into the micro cracks and fissures that make up rock art sites as well. Turning then to Australia, is that floods are a major issue, and 2 years ago we had massive floods up along the Matawarra, the Fitzroy, and the southwest Kimberley, so those top two screen snips. The person in the great get-up over here is Anne Polina, who I acknowledge is part of the project we had. We've got an Australian Heritage grant to basically map the damage to cultural sites, including rock art sites that were along that river. And it just raises the issue, though, of water as, so fire, what I forgot to, so anyway, I'll get back to that. But water isn't just a thing that is out there that can cause damage or something that you can drink. In an Aboriginal understanding, water and certain rivers, certainly the Marawarra and also Derbal Yerrigan, the Swan, are considered actual beings, actual living entities that influence human life. And interestingly, Western Australian heritage legislation has both of those rivers as heritage sites. You know, all 700 plus kilometres of the Marawarra is a declared heritage site. Same deal with the Swan, that is, or a bit less. But it then goes further to say, well, the Marawarra is what enables everything to happen. So as part of our research collaboration agreement with the Marawarra Fitzroy River Council, representing 7 language groups, is the Marawarra River of Life has to be first author on all of our papers. And you can see from that screen snip, you know, this is in the Griffith Law Review. It is not, it is a fairly august journal. It's not just some weird journal. And actually in law understands the notion of a juridical person where you can constitute a forest or a river as a juridical person with rights, and that can act if damage is done to them, for example. So you can have that standing as well as personhood. It does raise then the issues, what our responsibilities to that river are and who its interlocutors are, because as Anne explained to me, the Marawarra doesn't speak English. And then just to conclude, you know, what is it that we can do? We tend to react, but maybe we need to act a little bit more. So there's some actions that are probably pointless, these larger climatic changes that we can't do all that much about. But we can have a look, we can have some practical actions, and there are some structural issues. So the first one, unsurprising to most, a lot of Australian archaeology, however, is still firmly in a processual phase. So sometimes we need to tease out things like binary oppositions, like the nature-culture opposition, being fundamentally unhelpful in all of what I've been talking about, because there is no nature. It is all, even if it does exist, it's experienced through a cultural lens and through various indigenous and other ontologies. It comes to being through a cultural lens, for example. So it's best just to abandon that and then combine it with understanding, right, climate change is inevitable on the one hand, but at the same time, we do need constant adaptation for the things that we can mitigate. We can, you know, things like degrowth, decarbonisation. I mean, has everyone thought about their field work and what its carbon footprint and what the offsets to that carbon footprint might be, for example, as one practical action? You know, it's important to have a varied workforce type of thing. We recently did a survey of incoming archaeology students at Australian universities. 36% report a physical or mental disability, which is almost double the national average at 20%, which is surprising in a field discipline like archaeology. But also having, you know, younger folks in there as well, who are more immediately affected by the consequences of climate change. And then moving over into kind of more networked individuals, you know, post-humanism and those kinds of things, we're in the unique position to negotiate our succession from Homo sapiens sapiens to whatever else we will become. So how will we affect that handover with respect to cultural heritage, climate change, and particularly rock art, for example? Pyroscapes are always very kind of interesting. So there are, it literally is a burning and metaphorically is a burning topic here. Everyone gets excited about it in good or bad ways. We're now in a year-round burning cycle. California is the same. And it's usually a doom and gloom kind of thing. But what's been overlooked is there's a real gap in looking at fire as a tool for the positive management of heritage. So how do you do that? There's good international best practice. So in some cases, like on the image there, is by burning, you expose sites, spiritually important sites to people, in this case Native Americans, that had been lost from view and memory. So the burning can expose those sites, doesn't damage the sites. Experimental work has been done, as you see in the other screen snip. And then interesting things like burning some sites, or more delicate sites, burns done away from them, so green shoots grow so that animals who otherwise walk over sites are attracted to the green shoots where the burning happens. Victor Stephenson has this great book, and drawing from it, plus the spin-off effects from particularly the Kimberley Visions project, is there are all of these things that one can do. What's really important, though, is to have empirical evidence of the damage fire does or does not cause to cultural heritage, because it's a very media-worthy thing, but very seldom do you have the empirical evidence for it. A great engagement tool are all kinds of technology, apps using remote sensing, satellite images, and all of those kinds of things. I'm going quickly now because really I'm in the last 2 minutes. This is our little case study that we used. There's a screen snip of the app, Lara, looking after Lara, that we used. And we found one of the two benefits. One is it got traditional owners or indigenous people out on country, which is very hard to do. It's expensive. You need a vehicle, fuel, time, all of those kinds of things. And as a result of that, those on-country days, which the Kimberley Land Council, who we report back to, see as our #1 KPI, our #1 key performance indicator of the research, above peer-reviewed articles, number of sites found, and all of those things, because they can see measurable, they have measurable improvements in physical health, people away from towns, from the grog, all of that, they're living healthily, and mentally. People get very anxious if country is not being burnt, is not being looked after in various ways, and just knowing that it is being looked after reduces people's mental issues. And similarly with the mapping exercise, I'd hope to have the ArcGIS, the QGIS story map available for you, but we're still working on that. They're just some screen snips of it. This is really an inward and outward looking, it's not peer reviewed or that kind of thing. It's really to show people where the sites are and were, to map them, and then to put proper Indigenous cultural intellectual property protocols in place for the visitation of those sites for whenever the next flood will happen, because it will happen. There are rock art sites all along there. So there are a lot of different challenges. The ones that I'll take up here is that, in Australia, it's a surprisingly divided country. About 6% of people identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, about 24% of the 24 million people. Last year's referendum on recognising Aboriginal people in the Constitution was voted no, which caused huge upset with people. You probably heard about Juukan Gorge and blowing up a 46,000-year-old site by Rio Tinto. And then you might have heard about our heritage legislation that came into force last year, 6 years in the making, lasted for 39 days, and then because of political pressure, reverted back to a 50-year-old, no longer fit for purpose act, for example. And what we found strongly is that young people should be given responsibility early. They're going to live with the consequences of these decisions. So like politics, in our family, we reckon no one over 40 should be in politics, because they won't be living with the consequences of their actions. These are all the kinds of benefits that you have. It's a really rewarding sort of two-way type of exercise where you find what's important to people and how your research might be used to improve things. There's a social justice truth-telling agenda by recognising first law. So while we have 3 heritage laws, first law hasn't gone away, for example. And there is a lot of work, like with Queens of Sheba and Great Zimbabwe, still here too, about folks from elsewhere. And then just finally, to end off, last slide, that with all the conservation stuff, also not to neglect, again, get back to this question that I'm sort of bothering or exercising my mind more and more about how in the past rock art and people interacted in order to manage an ever-changing world. I hesitate to use the word mechanism for rock art, but it's that kind of thing. And on that note, I'll stop sharing, and if there's anyone still left out there and there are any questions, I'll be happy to field them.
Thank you very much, Sven, for that fascinating talk. I particularly enjoyed the bits about Tynkiesburg, having been there recently, and the poetic justice of the stone on the floor. Do we have any questions from the audience? Those of you that are still with us.
How is Tynkiesburg holding up?
Fairly well. I don't think it's visited often, but it's in good condition. It's very difficult. I mean, the repair that was done there is amazing, and if it's not pointed out to you that a large chunk of the painted surface fell on the floor and had to be stuck back on, you almost don't notice it. So I think it's doing quite well.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose in some cases, that's how these shelters form in part anyway, or they weaken, and then events like that, or like a water that then you have a cold winter and a frost freezing might happen. There is one thing with the interpretive notice boards. Fairly late in life, I've been diagnosed with dyslexia, and in there I thought I'd written that it's a sacred site, but it comes out as it's a scared site. So you might know.
These things. Jeanette, I see your hand is raised. Please go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Sven.
Hi, Jeanette.
Good to see you.
Yeah, lovely.
You mentioned that something about the heritage legislation that seems to have been thrown out. What's that story?
So, how long have you got? So Australia is still deeply in a colonial phase. It's not in a post-colonial phase. Archaeology starts off reasonably recently, really the 1960s with John Mulvaney, maybe a little bit before that. And in Western Australia, which is a third of Australia, is really big. So, stepping back, we don't have a national heritage law here. We have a national environmental law called Environmental Protection by Diversity Act that actually has some heritage provisions. And we have a state level Environmental Protection Act that actually has better provisions than the heritage legislation. So in addition to Aboriginal First Law, we have a Maritime Act, or Underwater Archaeology Act. And to say those submerged sites is now becoming very interesting because this was designed as a Shipwrecks Act. So it has to be redone together with its national counterpart. And then there we have the Heritage Act of 2018. So that's largely built heritage or colonial heritage. And then we have the Aboriginal Heritage Act, which is, as the name says, Aboriginal Heritage Act. It came about first started from 1969 when sacred stones from a place called Weibo were being sold, and everyone, including the person selling them, thought that that was the wrong thing to do. But there's no law stopping them. So it actually had a very positive genesis in that there were people camping outside the state parliament's laws saying we need a heritage act. So in 1972, the Aboriginal Heritage Act comes about. Pretty good act, administered by the WA Museum, then moves to the Department of Aboriginal Affairs as it was then. And then subsequent amendments and changes to the regulation. So the Act has the reading speech, the Act, the regulations and case law. There have only been 5 prosecutions since 1972 under that Act, for example. It sort of sounds familiar, I'm sure. But all the subsequent amendments have watered down the Act so that it essentially becomes a compliance industry largely for the extractive resources industry, mining and similar, water and so on. And it got to the point that here in the 2010s, late 2010s, everyone, for different reasons, but everyone, industry, archaeologists, Aboriginal people, etc., were very unhappy with the Act and was no longer fit for purpose. So a 6-year process of consultation was started for what was known as the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, which was rolled out last year. And then because of a concerted media campaign, issues around farmers against the Act, it got canned. So really weak state-level political leadership just caving to vested sectional mining and farming interests. Because really what we're just trying to say to people, if you say to a person, you need to do an environmental impact assessment to do whatever you want to do on the land, everyone says, yes, we understand that, we'll get in the water people, the butterfly people, whatever, it takes so long, it costs so much. And this was just trying to normalize saying, well, you also need to do an HI, heritage impact assessment, that kind of does the same. And so instead of delaying the Act or rolling it out over another year, we reverted to the old Act. That is unprecedented in legal history, in legal heritage history. Andrew Gay, a lawyer here, has been doing work on that with me. We've not found anywhere in the world where an act has lasted 39 days and then been repealed and replaced by the previous Heritage Act. In fact, there are very few pieces of legislation, full stop, where such a rescission has happened. So we are now in this period where we've got these 3 acts. So ideally we should have 1 act, but the referendum with a no vote means Aboriginal people are not at all keen for government to have anything to do with their heritage. So when I have to apply for what's called a Section 16 permit to remove rock art for dating, I now have traditional owner groups say to you, this is our land and we give you permission. We in fact forbid you to go to your government, not the government, not our government, but to your government and get that permission because that affects our sovereignty, for example. So now people, the regulator, the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, which has lots of good staff there that are trying to do the best they can under impossible circumstances, are are trying to look at sections of the Act from before that weren't really activated, or to strengthen them, but they're hampered by the relevant minister, there are actually two ministers, saying that we are not going to issue, the government is not going to issue much in the way of regulations to interpret how this Act will go about. So that's about as short as I can make it. It's a real schmozzle, it's a real train smash. And so what it means is that responsible sort of citizens and practitioners are doing international best practice. So the government has said this is the floor, or the minimum level of competence, which really is or compliance rather, which really is very low. And the sort of inverted commas good people are going well and above that, not necessarily out the goodness of the heart. Some of the mining companies have decadal relationships with Aboriginal groups that would be their social license and literally their mining licenses would be jeopardized. But there are a lot of smaller operators that then say, well, we'll just do the minimum or not at all. So we're in this kind of Wild West phase, and it really is the Wild West. I would mention that Western Australia has had 3 secessionist movements in the past, quite serious ones too.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sven, for a very detailed but very important explanation. Do we have any other questions, quick questions for Sven? You can just go ahead if you do have a question.
Just
Sven,
a comment. Really.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Just a comment, really, that I get the impression from what you've been saying, Sven, is that it's actually quite a conflicted country. With a whole lot of with legislation and things that seems to be aimed to do good and to facilitate and acknowledge Australians. But on the other hand, as in South Africa, water and mining are very difficult things to try and stop, and even mitigation is difficult. So it's interesting that conflict, and I think it's something that we have here. And then, of course, we don't have those strong lobby groups, as you know. The sort of Khoisan organisations and groups are also plagued by, lack of recognition, dissent, all those kind of things. Anyway, just a comment.
Yeah, no, so well, as a comment on a comment, so, I've been quite interested in comparing Australia, particularly Northern Australia and Southern Africa. There are lots of interesting parallels, some similar, figures in common. George Gray, for example, some of the body snatchers or collectors, and they're these kind of quite finite colonial circuits. Sort of written a couple of papers on some of the similarities, but South Africa is well ahead of the game in terms of understanding heritage as a common concern, while there are some debates around evolution and those kinds of things. Archaeology, rock art are in the public imagination, are available, are in the syllabus, all of those kinds of things, where there's still a long way to go here. I think medium long term, the outlook is good. Teachers have just been tasked with teaching deep time history, and they're saying, what the hell is that? And they don't have material. They're not against it. When I do outreach in schools, the kids all love it, all of those kinds of things, but it's very piecemeal, and it comes down to, an Australian identity. So a lot of people, like myself, have come here fairly recently, or not that, some people say, I've been here a long time, 5 generations kind of thing. And many people are largely unaware of the Aboriginal history going back however many years it is, at least in a Western reckoning of time. So the whole notion of what it means to be an Australian is very sectional. There isn't an overarching one. So there are important differences between the two places like that. But then, as you say, there are transnational global issues around resources, water and mining in particular, that are shared, and that us with an archaeological sort of framing where we look at time in multiple scales can say something like, how long is that dam? What's the use life of that dam before it silts up? And people say, well, if we're lucky, it'll make 100 years kind of thing. The people I work with on the Matawarra, they live in what are called remote area communities, although, as I was told one time very definitely by Auntie Tootsie Daniel, she said, this is not a remote area community. Perth is a remote area community. This is home, point taken. But they live on welfare, so it's $14,000 a year. Understanding poverty in Australia, poverty in Southern Africa are not actually the same thing at all. But people, for their livelihood, need to fish and get resources out of the river, but also the river gives them strength. So when I have Aboriginal students, I show them on campus here, just showing them around. They say, I don't know what I'm going to study, but I'm going to study here because that river is there and it kind of speaks to me. So very often, particularly the water issues are seen as, oh, we can have more water, that sort of talks about, maybe Cape Town can have desalination. Perth gets 60% of its water from desalination, and we can afford to because it's a wealthy country, but other places can't. But that sort of technological solution is given in generally, and it ignores the cultural element by and large. Or indeed, as I was saying earlier, the notion that the river can be an entity, a thing to which we have relationships and responsibilities, for example.
Sven, thank you very much for joining us from Australia, the end of a long day. Thank you to everyone online for joining us.